We are back from our break, and we are going to hear from our keynote address now. And he is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He studies and provides commentary on American politics with a focus on how America's political order is being upended by populist challenges from the left and the right. Dr. Olsen is an opinion columnist for the Washington Post, where he writes daily pieces focusing on politics, populism, foreign affairs, and American conservative thought. He also studies populism's impact in other democracies in the developed world. He served 7 years as vice president and director of the National Research Initiative at the American Enterprise Institute. He previously worked as vice president of programs at the Manhattan Institute and president of the Commonwealth Foundation. His predictions of the 2008, 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18 elections were particularly praised for their remarkable accuracy, and we look forward to hearing his insight on the upcoming 2020 election. Please welcome Dr. Henry Olsen.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's wonderful to be back in the San Gabriel Valley, if only virtually. Unmentioned was I'm a graduate of Claremont McKenna College from 1979 to 1983. And I can remember when you couldn't see the mountains most of the time. I'm glad you live in a much cleaner environment than we did back in those days. The presidential election has been noted for a lot of things, not the least of which the remarkable comeback that Joe Biden staged in the 4 days between the South Carolina primary and Super Tuesday. But at a two-party level, it is most notable for its stability. That is to say that Joe Biden has led in virtually every public poll. His lead now in the Real Clear Politics average is nearly the same as it was months ago. And President Trump's job approval rating, while on the upswing, remains mired in a level at which his reelection is highly improbable. So the large takeaway I want to leave you with is expect a Biden victory, expect Democratic control of the Senate, but be wary and be aware of how that could possibly change depending on what happens in the last 60 days. So the most important number that I am looking at right now is the president's job approval rating. And the reason for that is simple. Throughout the history of modern polling, which is to say, going back to 1972, we have 8 different examples of a president running for re-election, or in the case of Gerald Ford, another term, although of course he had been appointed vice president and hadn't actually been elected. In all of those circumstances but one, the presidents who ran for re-election received nearly identically what, as a share of the vote, what his final job approval rating was, whether it is the Gallup poll back in the day when polling was less frequent, or more recently in the Real Clear Politics average. The one exception is 1996 with Bill Clinton, when he ran substantially behind his job approval rating. But that was also a race that had third-party independent Ross Perot. And as analysts for the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia have pointed out in an article on the must-read Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, when you strip that out and you create a two-party index, Bill Clinton received, yep, you've got it, nearly 1 point, within 1 percentage point of the two-party vote, what his job approval rating was. So President Trump's job approval rating as of about an hour ago was 45.1% on the Real Clear Politics average. If it passed his prologue, then we would expect that in the election being held today, he would get somewhere between 44.5% and 45.5% of the popular vote. That's not enough. That's not even enough to win a narrow majority in the Electoral College, because most people who study these things recognize that the president can repeat what he did last time, which is lose the popular vote substantially and win the Electoral College. but there's only a certain margin by which he can lose the popular vote and still have that. If he gets 45% of the popular vote, give a couple of percent to third parties and write-ins, that means he'll probably lose to Biden by somewhere around 7 to 8 points. And that's much too large for him to be able to win the Electoral College. There's a dispute over what that number is. Some people say he has to keep it as close as he did in 2016, which is say lose to Biden by 2% nationally. Others noting the large swing against him among certain populations like whites with a college degree that are overrepresented in states that are already likely to be safe for one party or another, think it could be as large as 4%. I happen to split the difference. I think he can lose by a little over 3% nationally and still have a fighting shot of winning the Electoral College. But however you slice and dice it, 45% is way too low. So the number I'm looking at is 47%. If you get to 47%, if he gets to 47% in his job approval rating, then just giving a couple of percent to third-party candidates and write-ins, that means he's got a fighting shot of being 3 or 3.5 points behind Biden, and that gives him a fighting shot of getting to 270 Electoral College votes. So what are the odds that Donald Trump will get to that level? Well, again, it doesn't look good. He's only been at or above that level for about a week throughout his entire presidency, and that was in the middle to end of March when he was briefly experiencing a COVID bounce, as virtually every incumbent office holder or leader, whether at US state levels, provincial levels in Canada, or national levels abroad, were experiencing at that time. He then started his daily COVID pressers, and his approval rating started to drop, and he has not been at 47% or above since then. If Trump can do that, he can only do that by convincing people who have largely disapproved of his presidency throughout to give him the benefit of the doubt in the last 60 days. How would he be able to do that? Well, he'd be able to do that by demonstrating that he's got some handle on the pandemic. And while things remain bad in California, cases are declining nationally and have been declining for many weeks. If that continues into the election day, perhaps he can do that. He can also do that by pointing to a V-shaped recovery. And again, California is an outlier here. The state level unemployment data don't come out until a couple of weeks after the national level, but I did look at the state level data as of July and compared it to the national level. California's unemployment rate at the time was 13.3%, over 3% higher than the national average. And in fact, in most of the swing states, unemployment in July was lower than the national average. That's not true in some of them, but in most of them it was. The national average is being driven up by states like New York or Massachusetts or California that are largely considered to be safe for the Democratic Party. August results in the job data nationally showed a substantial decline in unemployment. And if that bears true with respect to unemployment in swing states, it might explain why Trump's approval rating, while still below where he needs to be, has risen by nearly 4 points in the last 60 days. Trump needs this good news to continue to have a fighting shot at winning re-election. Now, last time we know that his approval ratings, then not a job approval rating, but a personal favorability rating, were low. He was viewed favorably by many fewer people than viewed Hillary Clinton favorably, but he won because 18% of Americans had a unfavorable opinion of both, and he won those people by close to 20 percentage points. So can he pull that off this time? Unlikely. And the reason why is simple, that in 2016, the sort of person who didn't like both candidates was highly likely, as I wrote in a New York Times op-ed in 2018, to be a suburban, college-educated man who liked Republicans on policy, but thought Trump was unfit for the presidency. Now, the person who doesn't like both candidates, which is a much smaller number, is as likely to be a progressive who doesn't like Biden but dislikes Trump more as they are to be a Republican who dislikes Trump but likes many of his policies. That means that Trump's effort to try and draw a contrast with Biden and basically run a campaign of Trump, not perfect, just better, has a smaller number of people to reach than that campaign did with Hillary Clinton. The people who don't like both candidates are not as open to that message as the people who don't like both candidates were in 2016. So everything in me that looks at numbers and projects out, which is my stock in trade, tells me that the odds of Donald Trump winning the presidency are quite low. So what to look for? Well, one is that that double dose of good news. Obviously, the president is also trying to use his unique power of the foreign policy bully pulpit. The peace agreement deals that he has helped broker between Israel and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates is a case of micro-targeted politicking. That there's a poll that came out yesterday that said that Trump was at 30% of the Jewish vote. That is low in an absolute sense, but it would be tied for the high among Republicans since 1988. Every small increment can help him win re-election in small states that have large targeted populations, and Jewish voters are close to 5% of the vote in ultra-marginal Florida. Trump is also doing better than expected among Latino voters, and it's not just Cuban voters who traditionally lean Republican. Poll after poll shows he's doing better among Mexican Americans who can vote as well. Mexican Americans are large parts of the population in Nevada, in Arizona, and in Texas, and a non-insignificant part of the voting population in Georgia and in North Carolina. Puerto Ricans, he's also doing better than expected with, and they are the second largest group of Hispanics in Florida. Again, a marginal increase here from 27 or 29%, whatever he actually got in 2016, to 33%. Doesn't seem like a lot, but it could be the difference between keeping Arizona, which is essential to his campaign, or losing Arizona, or keeping Texas, which is essential to his campaign, or losing Texas. So these are some of the things that you should be looking for when you're trying to assess whether Donald Trump can win the presidency or not. Marginal improvements in groups that may not show up in national polling, but are ultra important in some of these winner-take-all states, and whether or not he can show a slow but steady rise in his job approval rating. If and when he managed to hit a 46% level, that would be a warning bell that this race could tighten quite quickly in the last few days as people may make a sudden decision. 46% isn't enough to win, but it's enough where a small, late news item could shift enough people that he could manage to eke out another victory. But as I said, the odds are strong that we're looking at a Biden victory. So then the question is, what does Biden bring home with him? Now, most observers note that we are moving towards a straight ticket voting world where if you vote Democrat or Republican for president, you are highly likely to vote Democrat or Republican for lower offices. And that means that if Biden wins the presidency, he is likely to bring home with him at least a 50-50 Democratic Senate, which the Vice President, Kamala Harris, would then be able to cast ties and let the Senate Democrats organize the United States Senate. The break-even point here is roughly 4 percentage points. And the reason why is because of the states that are up. Democrats are trying to take 2 states that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016 and which Joe Biden will almost certainly carry in 2020. Colorado and Maine, that are held by Republicans. Polls at the statewide level show both candidates running well behind their Democratic challengers. They're trying to pick up a 3rd state that Trump narrowly won, but that Democrats won in a Senate race in 2018, and that is Arizona. Again, polls show both Trump and Republican incumbent Martha McSally to be behind. Republicans are almost certain to pick up a seat in Alabama because they lost it only because the absurd Judge Roy Moore was the Republican nominee, and he only narrowly lost Democratic Doug Jones on a day that perhaps not coincidentally also marked Donald Trump's low job approval rating nationwide for his entire presidency. That was in 2017. So that leaves Democrats with a net gain of 2. Where do they get their third seat? Well, they have to go into red territory. They have to go into territory that Trump won last time. And that means winning a Senate seat in Montana, where despite Trump winning by 20 points last time, it looks entirely plausible, as my column today in the Post argues, that Democrat Steve Bullock could, as he's done before, win this state because he's a different type of Democrat. It means looking at North Carolina, a state that Trump won by about 4 points last time, but where polls show him running roughly even and his Republican incumbent Tom Tillis running a little bit behind him. It means looking at states like Georgia, which Trump won by 5 points last time, but which Republican Governor Brian Kemp won by less than 2 points in 2018, and which polls show Republican incumbent David Perdue only narrowly ahead and below 50%. If Biden can win by more than 4 points, he should win, or Democrats should win, at least one of these Senate seats. And with that, they get to the 50-50 tie that Kamala Harris can break. Now, what happens if Trump starts slipping back, if he starts making mistakes and instead of 45% job approval, he's back where he was a couple of months ago, which is at 41%? Well, that's the nightmare scenario for Republicans, because then you're talking about a Biden win that is much likelier to be somewhere in the 10 to 12 point range, a landslide of the sort we haven't seen in a long time. And if that's the case, then Katie bar the door for Republicans. We'd likely be looking at North Carolina. We'd likely be looking at one or both Georgia seats, because there's a special election that is also on the ballot going to the Democrats. We're looking at the possibility of almost certainty of Montana going. We would look at the possibility of Kansas, of Texas, of Iowa, of maybe even Alaska, if you're talking about a Biden landslide. So this is why I think that Biden is likely to gain both the presidency and have, if not firm control, at least nominal control of the Senate. That the odds suggest that he'll win by more than 4 points, and the odds suggest that it's a likelier chance that he'll win by 7, 8, 9, or 10 points than it is for Trump to cut the margin to 2 or less. And that would mean that Biden would come in with a firm Democratic majority in the House, a reasonable, if not large, Democratic majority in the Senate, and a large popular and electoral vote mandate that could help sway some swing seat Republicans to break ranks and try and cut a deal with him on legislation early within his term. Don't expect Senate races to run very differently than the presidential races. Now, you're in California, so you're not seeing any Senate ads, but in the rest of the country, you're seeing ads all over the place. I just got back from Alaska, and there the Republicans are running ads tying the Democrat candidate, who's actually a registered independent, but can be the Democratic nominee because of Alaska's election law. And they've got video of him saying that his sympathies are on the left and that he would caucus with the Democrats. So they're saying, don't be fooled. This guy's not an independent. He's actually a Democratic wolf in independent sheep clothing. And they're hoping that that will keep the seat in Republican hands. But what we'll find is that all these things is largely efforts to rally the otherwise partisan majority, which means that these candidates will rise or fall depending on how well Donald Trump does at the top of the ticket. The same is likely to be true for House races. And while control of the House really is not disputed, the only way Republicans have a fighting shot of getting control of the House is if somehow they can get Trump to within 2 percentage points in the popular vote or less. There are a number of individual House seats that can go Republican and are likelier to go Republican the closer the margin is. One of them is the 39th District of California, which features a rematch, of the 2018 race. The thing, though, to keep in mind here is that this is a seat that, even though it is ancestry Republican, voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. The Democrats, they were going into 2018, there were 26 of these seats that Republicans held that Clinton carried. Democrats won 23 of them, and they're favored to win at least one of the 3 left back this fall. It will be an extremely difficult proposition for young Kim to win against the national headway unless Donald Trump comes back in some way to make it a close race. Last time, Democrats won nationally by about 7%, once you account for the fact that Republicans didn't even field a candidate in 39 congressional districts, which exaggerated the Democrats' national popular vote lead. And Kim lost, I forget exactly the margin, but very narrowly, 2 points or less, I believe. So that suggests that this district is somewhere in the 4 to 5 points to the right, to the Republican side of the nation as a whole. If it looks like Trump's only going to lose by 4 or 5 points, well, that means that this district could very well, even as Joe Biden might likely carry it narrowly, it could very well be one where Kim is able to pull out a narrow victory. So in this, as in the Senate races, take a look at the presidential race if you want to get a sense of how it's going to turn out. Other races in Southern California to take a look at. Republicans are clearly going to contest California 45, but I doubt they're going to win that. That is one of the Irvine Laguna Hills space seat is one that voted for Clinton by a larger margin than the 39th, and it's also one where the Democratic incumbent is simply a fundraising machine. I would be very surprised if Republicans were able to win that seat back. California 48 is a different matter. And that's Michelle Steele trying to get back Dana Rohrabacher's old coastal Orange County district. That was another seat that Clinton won, but with less than 50% of the vote. It was another seat that was very close. And it's another one that if Trump can get the margin back into the range of 3 or 4 points nationally, it's entirely possible that Steele, who is a very good fundraiser, could eke out a narrow victory over Harley Rauda. But again, this is going to be a race, barring an unexpected mess up by the incumbent, that's going to be decided on national partisan terms. It's not going to be decided on do you like Steele or do you like Rauda. People are by and large voting their party, not the person. One exception to that rule, one of the few exceptions to that rule, is in California 25, where Republican Mike Garcia easily defeated Christy Smith in the special election there, caused by Katie Hill's resignation in earlier this year, or in the latter part of last year. And one of the reasons for that is not just that Garcia, as a fighter pilot and an outsider, has an impressive resume, but because as a Latino, he did very well with Latino voters, and that this is a district that Democrats rely on a strong Latino vote in order to win. National observers who just a year ago were saying Republicans would have no chance of winning this seat now say it's at best a toss-up for the Democrats, and some have even rated it as lean Republican because Garcia has demonstrated a rare ability to get voters from a constituency that usually would back the other party. I'll note that back in October, I was one of the very few people who wrote a column and said, hey, take a look at this race. This district's more Republican than most people think. So it didn't surprise me when Garcia won, although I was surprised he won by the large margin that he did. But this is one seat that I think Republicans will hold, that was one that even today could easily be voting for Joe Biden for the presidency. In California, the other seats to take a look at for Republican opportunities are California 10, but especially California 21, where David Valadao is trying to win his seat back. He demonstrated a large ability to win crossover votes throughout his tenure in Congress, and with a turnout that, while it will be up across the board, will likely slightly be more Republican than the turnout in 2018. That very close race could swing back the other way. But by and large, what you should be expecting is that House seats will follow the presidential race, and the presidential race will be decided largely by Donald Trump's performance, not by Joe Biden's performance. Again, absent a sort of unforgivable or unexpected gaffe or breakdown on the behalf of Biden. So in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that you should be expecting a Democrat-controlled federal government. You should be expecting the likelihood of that being a reasonable Democratic majority to be somewhat larger than the likelihood of a Republican comeback or the likelihood of a narrow enough Trump loss that Republicans hold control of the Senate. And if you are following the numbers, the number you should be looking at more than anything else is his job approval rating. For Donald Trump not to come close to that would break over nearly 50 years of political history. And while Donald Trump did seem to break political history in 2016, a closer look at the data suggests that he actually put together a very shrewd, electorally efficient coalition, which is just to say that he's a much better politician than most people give him credit for. And with that, I would like to turn it over to you for your questions, because I always find that the questions hone in on the things you're interested in much more effectively than what I can anticipate through my larger presentation. Thank you.
Dr. Olsen, thank you so much. We have been taking some questions in the chat, and I've kind of curated a few for you, if you would be so kind. So if Trump loses, according to your prediction, by the way, I'm going to do my over and under bet soon. Is there a possibility of Trump leading a protest against a rigged election? Could we see some sort of crisis as a result? What's your thought?
I think we're as likely to see a protest if Trump wins as we are if Trump loses. I think a lot of it will depend on the margin. That if Trump clearly is getting wiped out, he has no ability to say that there was a rigged election, that any but the most fever-headed Trump acolytes would believe. The closer the election, the more likely he could to make that argument. I don't think that he's going to stay in office if he loses the election. And I think people worried about a nightmare scenario of an intransigent president are more projecting their fears than calculating the probabilities. It's not zero, but I don't think it's very high. But it does rise the closer and more protracted the count is on and after Election Day.
Mm-hmm. And to stick with the kind of controversial discussion, how will a nationwide mail-in voting ballot affect everything? Will there be a delay in knowing the outcome of multiple races? What's your thought there?
Well, every state is different. They all have different rules, and they all have different capacities for counting these mail-in ballots. Florida just held a primary a few weeks ago, and it had a largely mail-in electorate, but they've had a long time of experience, and they had nearly complete results within 2 or 3 hours of the polls closing. Other states that do not have that long experience have demonstrated serious capacity problems with respect to quickly counting those votes. There will be many races. There are always races we don't know the outcome on Election Day. Anyone in California politics knows that. A number of the House seats that Democrats won were decided by the after Election Day counted ballots. Fact is, usually 10 to 15 House races are not called by the AP until up to 3 weeks after the election. That's a normal occurrence. I wouldn't be surprised if there are a larger number of those this time because of states or counties that don't have experience with mail-in ballots, but it will vary from place to place. It'll vary on state or county capacity. And of course, it'll vary on the underlying competitive nature of the race. That I don't expect that mail balloting will cause as many problems as many people think, but there will be more races that we will find out the result after Election Day than there normally are, but it is not an abnormal occurrence.
Okay, thank you. We had a question about policies as well. And what kind of policies do you think would be not only a priority, but kind of the first 100 days of a Biden presidency?
Well, I think that's one of the great unanswered questions, that there's a large appetite on the Democratic left for this to be a 100 days that would rival Franklin Roosevelt's in its transformative effect. I think Biden's great political talent is finding the Democratic middle and embracing it as his own. That's what he is. People say he's a moderate, he's a conservative, he's a liberal. What he is he's a politician. And he has moved across the Democratic Party spectrum very effectively over a 48-year career. So what I would say is, what do you think the Democratic center is going to be in January? And whatever that is what Biden's agenda is going to be. At the very least, I expect a large COVID relief bill that looks a lot more like Nancy Pelosi's bill than what the Senate Republicans are passing. I would expect a repeal of many, if not most, of the Republican tax plan of 2017 to go pretty quickly. I would expect some form of expansion of healthcare, whether it is the public option he's talked about or increased subsidies. There is a great demand to increase access to health insurance among the Democratic Party, and I would expect that to go through in the first 100 days. I would expect a very large climate proposal to go through independently of the COVID stimulus. He's promised a $2 trillion over 4-year expenditure. That is the as large as that may sound to non-Democrats, that is the Democratic center, that the Democratic left wants much more, much faster. And I would be surprised if something like that didn't go through. And then you, of course, got regulatory changes, probably day one going back into the climate Paris Accord. He's already said that he wants to re-embrace the Obama-signed Iran nuclear arrangement. I would expect the first 100 days to be a sharp turn to the left, but perhaps not as sharp a turn to the left as many Republicans say and fear, just because Joe Biden is somebody who wants to hug the Democratic center, and he'll move with it, but he won't take a position that is too far outside of that.
Interesting. We've been focusing on Joe Biden, obviously, in this conversation. But what is your thought about what Kamala Harris can bring to the party, and what role would she play?
Well, yeah, I think that Biden envisions his vice president to be the political version of Mini-Me, for those of you who used to watch the Austin Powers series, that he thinks that he played a substantial role as somebody to whom important issues could be deputized. And I would expect him to do the same thing for Harris. I would expect Harris, given her race, her gender, and her experience, to be a lead person on things like criminal justice reform, like police reform, like race relations in America, like gender equality. At least in the first few months. Harris will be, in one sense, a more loyal than the Pope vice president. She knows that her political future, much as George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush knew his political future as a former foe of Ronald Reagan, depended on being a loyal vice president to Reagan. I expect that she will be extremely loyal to Biden, and that she will maneuver behind the scenes to take responsibility in areas where she thinks it will advance her political career, and that includes California's interests, but that she will make sure that there is in public not a hint of daylight's difference between her position and Biden. But I would expect him to use her, and particularly use her in a public way, on areas where she has a perceived advantage, like the areas that I mentioned.
Would you anticipate, perhaps in a Biden victory, that Harris might actually take over for the second term of presidency, or how do you view the age of Biden, I should say, without being,
Biden has done something that I'm not sure I would have done, but I understand why he's done it, which is to say he's holding out the possibility of running again. If I were him, to put the age issue aside, I actually would have said this is a one-term presidency. I'm doing something I didn't expect to do because we need to heal the country, and I'm going to play that role, and so forth. But nobody seriously thinks that an 82-year-old Joe Biden is going to run again. I'll put it this way: maybe Joe Biden seriously thinks he might run again, but nobody else in Washington thinks he's going to run again. And the last time a sitting Democratic vice president did not ultimately obtain the nomination of the Democratic Party was Alvin Barkley, who was Truman's vice president. Kamala Harris knows that she should be the nominee if Joe Biden wins and she is the vice president. What she has to do is hug Biden close. She needs to establish her own identity on issues that are both similar or identical to what Biden wants and are also helpful to key constituencies in the Democratic Party. And she has to then be prepared to be a slightly left of center version of Joe Biden. She can't be the progressive hope because she will be tied to an administration that will, as I mentioned, be the very definition of the Democratic center, and that will always disappoint the Democratic left. But anyone who thinks, if she is the vice president, that she won't be the nominee is making a fool's bet.
You know, it's interesting because we've had some questions just privately come in about you know, the next election, but who should be thinking about 2024 in the Republican Party?
Oh, well, there are already lots of people thinking about 2024. You know, I think assuming a Trump defeat, I think that reduces the odds of a Trump winning again. Trump would be constitutionally eligible to run again. You know, we do have the example of Grover Cleveland, who won, lost, and then won again. He's the only person to have regained the presidency. And since Trump will have only served one term, there's no constitutional bar. You can only serve 2 terms or 1 term plus more than half of a unfulfilled term in the case of a vice president who succeeds. But Trump clearly doesn't get barred by that. There are people who say he'll run again. He might, but I don't think he'll be quite as strong the second time around. Obviously, Mike Pence will want to run. Obviously, Nikki Haley is angling for that. I think the way to think about it is that there are basically 3.5 camps, what I call the imperial successors, people who, like Pence or like Don Jr., who will basically run with the slogan, more Trump, less tweet. I think there'll be people who are trying to restore the pre-Trump Republican Party, whether it is the hard right view of a Ted Cruz or the establishment view of the Mitt Romney wing. I call them the restorationists. And then there's people like Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton who are trying to, I call them the young reformers because they are all under 50. And they're all saying, look, Trump taught us something about the country that we need to adapt to. And that means a more activist view of the use of federal power, whether it is the regulation of the internet, which is Hawley's particular claim to fame, or a more aggressive use of immigration and tariff laws to help tighten the labor market and increase wages, which is Tom Cotton's thing. I think those 3 factions will be basically the sort, there will be many people competing for those crowns. Some of them we know, but the other thing we know about politics is there's always a dark horse who comes out. Mm-hmm. No one in 2017 would have said that one of the leading figures in American politics was going to be a 27-year-old New York waitress named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There will be somebody on the Republican side who emerges. I tried to do a profile of South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem in August. They turned down my request for a job interview. I was very clear that I thought she was angling to be a national figure. Well, she's going to New Hampshire later this month. Why do people go to New Hampshire in 2018 when there's not a serious race? It's the obvious reason. It's because they're angling to be a national figure. So I put her in the restorationist camp, that I think she wants to be the new face of the hard right, of the old right of Republican politics. So those are a few names. I don't think Ivanka will run in 2024. I think she wants to be president, but I think she's smart enough to know that being somebody in their young 40s trying to succeed, either succeed their father directly or indirectly without having other elected experience is not a ticket to the White House, whereas I think Don Jr. Doesn't see it quite the same way.
In extending the Biden-Harris ticket after post-election, should he win, who do you think would perhaps take Secretary of State, and who would fill the cabinet?
I think what Biden will do is use the cabinet to build the coalition, which I think Secretary of Treasury will be a compromise between the old Clintonistas and the progressives, so that each camp feels they have somebody they can talk to. My personal favorite for that is Governor Andrew Cuomo, which is why not put the governor from Wall Street, who has a foot in both camps, in the role of mediating the Democratic Party discussion over how to regulate Wall Street. I think you will find a African American person being appointed as Attorney General. Wouldn't be surprised if it's an African American woman. And that will go towards at least that wing of the Democratic Party. It's pretty clear that the EPA is the province of people who take climate science pretty seriously. So the only question is, how hard of a person are you going to put in there? But then I think defense and the Secretary of State are going to be people who are more in the centrist wing of the Democratic Party. And those are also the areas where I expect Biden to be more personally involved, because Biden, the one thing the president can't delegate to Congress is the conduct of foreign policy, and Biden thinks he's good at it. So I would expect Biden to put Biden loyalists. A lot of people say Michelle Flournoy would be the next Secretary of Defense. She's a leading intellectual on the center left here, acceptable to the establishment. I would be pretty surprised if it weren't her, but it would be somebody like that. And then, like if I wouldn't be surprised if Steve Bullock loses his run for Senate in Montana, that he becomes Secretary of the Interior, because what a better person to put in there than somebody who is a moderate Mountain State Democrat in a department that largely deals with Mountain State issues. And he would be somebody who would be acceptable to environmentalists, but not captive to environmentalists. That's the sort of way I think you should look at it, is that the cabinet is a way to build and maintain a coalition, and different groups will get somebody who make them happy. I'd be very in Obama's administration, he put in his friend Arnie Duncan in the Department of Education. I would not expect a middle of the road choice to go there. I would expect that to be somebody who is very, very friendly with the teachers unions.
Interesting. You alluded a bit to the global economy, just a touch at that last answer. And there was a question in the chat. I'm just scrolling to find it. How will the Biden presidency affect the U.S. relationship with China?
That is one of the $64,000 question, which the fact that I say that rather than 128,000 or whatever the game show is now dates me. There is large popular pressure to deal with China. That's something polls have shown, not just here, but in other countries, that people recognize that China is not quite a benign actor. There's also a lot of commercial pressure to rock the boat as little as possible. And I think Biden is going to apply what he does domestically to the China relationship as well, which is find a way to make all sides at least content, which is to say, I think I wouldn't be surprised if he raises human rights much more than prior Democrats did. The question of the camps in Xinjiang and the crackdown on Hong Kong. But I'd be very surprised if Biden adopted unilateral tariffs against China. I'd be very surprised if Biden didn't try and bring China into the climate talks. China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, and their emissions are rising, whereas ours are falling. So I think Biden will use a policy of engage and persuade, but he recognizes that this is not the same playing field as it was when he was vice president, when international public opinion and domestic public opinion was more favorable to China.
Yeah, interesting. Well, you know what, we have learned so much. I know I have, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Olsen, to chat with us today about your predictions. And we have
my final prediction will come out the weekend before election. I reserve the right to change my mind.
Oh, absolutely.
Giving you good odds.
Absolutely, you can. And we're just a few weeks away, just not right. It's just right down the road. Thank you for giving us your time today, and